So before I begin, I'd just like to thank all the funding partners that Bess has already mentioned. So the BC Grain Producers, the Peace Region Forage Seed Association, the CAP program, so the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, the BC government and the Canadian government. Also, I guess at this point, Climate Action BC, and also Bess and the Northern Hort Co-op. So the BC Prairie Pest Monitoring Project started in 2014. Like Bess has mentioned before, there's a bit of a disconnect from the Peace region for the rest of the province. Somehow, once you cross the Rockies, it seems to go away. So there's a lack of monitoring in the pest for field crop entomology. And so a federal entomologist out of Beaver Lodge in Alberta approached some of the local grain producers, some of the associations to try and address this issue because federally they also have a lot of budget issues, so they couldn't come into the province and do monitoring. So this was the project was kind of a filler in a sense to stop or to see what was happening in the BC Peace. So they started focusing on mostly annual cropping, which is mostly canola and cereals. And then I joined in 2016, and my predecessor left, and we started venturing into forages, so grasses and legumes that were grown for seed. And as the project has progressed, we have kind of gotten further and further into it and looking at hay and pasture land as well. So trying to help out the local cattle producers in the area to determine some insects that may be found in their fields and just give a heads up, transfer knowledge and stuff like that that's available, because it seems that knowledge is power. And sometimes people don't usually know what's going on in the fields. And I mean, with large scale agriculture, it's sometimes hard to see all that stuff that's going on. So in 2020, so this year, despite COVID, we were granted some funding from BC Climate Action to look into doing some horticulture monitoring as well. So that's kind of where Bess and I got together, and I was super excited to get into this. And so, yeah, so I thought initially when they proposed this to me, I was like, yes, we're going to do it all, go big. And then I had to kind of like wrap my head around everything, look at insects that were potentially up here. So you can see from the little horticulture, I guess, diagram that I have there, you can see that some of the stuff that we've looked at that I quickly pulled in talking to a provincial entomologist, Tracy Huppelhauser, there's quite a few. And some of them actually carry over into some of the other crops that we monitor currently. So the canola and some of the cereals a little. So yeah, so we thought, well, we can do some. So we thought maybe starting small, picking certain insects that would maybe be here and maybe not. So, because a lot of the stuff that we're currently doing hasn't been done before. So it's a lot of baseline work and determining presence or absence. So we focused on pests that we were finding in canola. We thought we could look into coal crops or crucifers, so all your brassicas, and help with that side of it, and see if there is a preference if we're finding them in canola and in the horticulture stuff, so in the gardens. The other one was that we'd look for spotted winged Drosophila. I know down in on the other side of the mountains, especially down in the valley, in the Fraser Valley, and in the Okanagan, it's a big pest for any berries or apples. So we thought we'd look to see if it's up here. And then also we would use some pitfall trapping to determine what click beetle species we have up here, also cutworms. And then we would also look at beneficial insects that we were looking to find, just to counterbalance all the pests that we look at. We also do find beneficials, and it's always nice for people to know that, there is something good going on out there for an insect. So yeah, so we use those traps. The biggest tool that we were using this year, though, is that we were going to do a lot of scouting and a lot of photography. Me, myself, I have a lot of field crop entomology experience. So venturing into horticulture is completely new and exciting, but also a little scary for me because it means I have to learn a lot more and kind of go back to school in the sense of trying to figure everything out. So, yeah, so the area is monitored. We did for horticulture. The Baldonnel one, that's really close to Fort St. John, just to give a perspective. And then the little airplane that you see really close to the border of the Alberta BC border, that's probably Dawson Creek. So, and then Doki siding is just south of Chetwynd. So we chose these areas in a bit of a strategic pattern to go with all the other monitoring that I do. So this is currently what we monitor for all the other crops included. And then I just added actually Chetwynd, Dawson Creek, and Fort St. John to give someone a bit of perspective of where we travel. So we do this over 3 days. I was lucky enough this year to get a student. Usually it's just me that does all this. And it's quite a bit of work. It usually takes me about 3.5 days to do all the monitoring. So I was lucky enough to get a student. So, so the findings that we obviously found aphids this year. We had an unusually high amount of rain this year, which led to us finding slug damage, not just in our crops like in the gardens, but we also found it in our field crops as well. And unfortunately with COVID this year, we would have sent off our specimens that we would have found and got them ID'd through the University of Alberta. They have a huge program right now to try and figure out what species of slugs are found. From what I could deter, it is usually the gray garden slug that has been commonly causing all the issues that we've had in the past 2 years up in the piece. The other big one that we had this year was grasshoppers. They're pretty bad in the BC piece and in the Alberta piece as well. And the two main species that we have are the two-striped and the Bruners, which is a new species on the pest list for the province as far as grasshoppers are concerned. And then, yeah, we saw a lot of diamondback moth damage this year on the crucifers this year too. So here's just a picture of an area that we had swept, actually right by Bess's garden in Rose Prairie for grasshoppers. And as you can see, I think that's probably about 10 sweeps, and there's probably about 30 plus grasshoppers in that bag. So just to give someone perspective, when grasshoppers are bad, they are bad up there. So we also found flea beetle damage, which is pretty common early on in the season, and then you get a late surge of them in August as well. We put out yellow sticky traps to kind of entice them onto jumping on the sticky traps as well, and we do counts for them. And then also we were looking into seeing what others, it's another way of finding out what other insects are on there. Most insects are attracted to a yellow color, and so we did that. So we also looked into Saskatoons up in, I guess, in the Presbyterian area, and we found all these gulls. So in the bottom left corner, you can see some pictures of these gulls, and they're consistent with either a gull midge or a cynipid wasp. However, this year Saskatoons didn't do so great in the Peace region, and we were unable to kind of confirm if it was a gull midge, unfortunately, because the gull midge will affect the flowering, will affect the flowers of the Saskatoons. And with no flowers or berries, we couldn't determine that, but I would assume that it was more probably a cynipid wasp than the gull midge itself. Excuse me. We also did find aphids on the raspberries this year, which is consistent with a raspberry aphid. They're seem to be quite common through the prairies. Cutworms is a big one this year, is a big one for our local gardeners. And unfortunately, we didn't actually catch any cutworms. So I'll address that later. We did collect wireworms and some click beetles from some of the traps that we had set out this year. and I have yet to go through them and determine which species they are, but I can kind of tell that they are the two common ones that we mostly find, which is Hypnoides bicolor and Solatistomus destructor. An interesting one that we got this year up here when we were looking through our apple crops, our apple orchards, was codling moth damage. It was pretty consistent. We found it on a few trees. So again, probably next season, we're probably gonna start looking at maybe trapping for codling moth just to determine the presence or to see how high the numbers are up here. And then the other one that we had this year that was unusual was a root maggot. So there's about five different types of flies that fall under the Delia species. And so we have to rear them out to try and figure out which species it is. And unfortunately, it's a pretty hard process to rear them out, and I wasn't successful. So we're going to try again next year if we do have the same issue. So some of the beneficials that we found, which are quite common, were ground beetles. So you can see one there on the left side on the tree. They're quite big. They vary actually in size. I think there's about 2,500 species of ground beetles in Canada. And they're beneficial in the sense that they eat lots of insects, lots of soft-bodied insects. We also had rovids or Staphylinidae as well that we caught in our pitfalls. Ladybird beetle seemed very common. If you can see on the bottom right there, we had a large presence of them in most of our crops, and I think a lot of that had to do with the high numbers of diamondback larvae that we were seeing this year in some of the crops as well, and also with all the aphids that we were seeing too. They like to eat aphids. I think ladybugs can eat up to something like 50 aphids a day, which is pretty good. We also had lacewings, lots of parasitic wasps, both ichneumons and brachynoids present. And then bees. We saw lots of European honeybees, lots of bumblebees. We caught a few sweat bees this year in our HAZCAP monitoring down in Chetwynd. And then hoverflies, and then mites. You can see the harvestmen that we took pictures of on the raspberries. They're quite common. And then wolf spiders. Unfortunately, I couldn't get my picture of the giant wolf spider, the female wolf spider that we found, but she was quite pretty. And then potential monitoring for next season. We would like to look at doing some cutworm work to determine what species are present up here in the piece and kind of nail that down. There are some cutworms that can migrate in, much like the army worms that we do have up here in the piece. The codling moth is one that we would really like to do just to confirm with an insect trap. We can always pheromone bait it, and then probably continue doing spotted wing Drosophila work. Considering that's a pest that is both found in other parts of the prairies, I think in talking to the provincial entomologist, it was confirmed in Alberta, and it is also present down in the southern BC area as well. So that might be one that is making its way up here, much like other insects that are finding their way further north with climate change. And then, those ones that are highlighted in yellow, we would also probably like to try and look at seeing the carrot weevil, the carrot rust fly, if we could. The Colorado potato beetle is a big one. It's found in other parts of Canada, also down in the Okanagan and in the Fraser Valley. Sorry for all the short definitions, but the ones in the crucifers, the big one to worry about is the cabbage sea pod weevil. So that's the CSPW, and the pea leaf weevil as well, which are both found currently in Alberta and in the Alberta piece. And they've been slowly making their way in the past few years west into I think just east of Grand Prairie. So and then we didn't see much damage in the raspberry monitoring that we did. One that we'd really like to look for is the raspberry sawfly, just because it can devastate a raspberry crop pretty quickly if it is there. And then, yeah, we would like to try and look into corn as well, just to see what we could find. We did a bit in Bess's garden in Rose Prairie and didn't see much aside from lots of slug damage and lots of grasshopper damage. But we would like to take a bigger look in there for European corn borer. That's a big one. And then, yeah, cutworms seem to really like corn. So we would try and determine if there's Western bean cutworm as well. And that's about it, really, for the potential. So any questions?
Yeah, Keith, Jan Sloomp here. Very interesting. Do you advise how to mitigate against those pests, or I assume for organic producers it's a bit different than commercial producers, but does your work go beyond recognizing what is there?
So yeah, so part of my job, in some sense, I can. I mean, I am contractually obligated by the Forage Seed Association not to give recommendation per se, but the other part of what I do is a lot of research into techniques that work, or techniques for control. So, I mean, we look at in some particular, if there's, say, cutworm issues, we will look at maybe using seeing if a producer will be interested in using diatomaceous earth, or an organic pesticide or organic controls that could potentially meet that. So that's one of the things that we do in the off season, is we also make up fact sheets and stuff like that, so that people can realize that there are ways of controlling it without using just straight pesticides.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, from some of the producers that are not in the Peace region, are there any insects that you guys have seen that you may feel concerned about? That's one of the things that I was curious about here, because there are ones that you guys see down in other areas that we don't particularly see up here, and they might not have been on my slides.
It's Carmen here. Quite a few of the same pests are down on the Vancouver Island. We have the evil wireworm, and yeah, and the flea beetles are a big problem for us.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions from anyone? All right. Thank you so much for the presentation and the great work you're doing. It's interesting to see how similar some of the bugs are anyways. And Bess, did you have a question? Or you're...
I think I have a whole suite of questions to unpack and kind of figure out a little bit more, but I just wanted to thank Keith so much for the work. And yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of us at some point will probably, as we develop farms in the Peace region in horticulture, because there aren't a million existing farms there, looking at support for integrated pest management and that type of thing, and kind of strengthening some of the support that we can provide for producers up here. But thank you so much, Keith.
Yeah, no problem. I think one of the big issues that we have up in the Peace is trying to bridge that connection to the rest of the province. And so that's one of the things that I find just in general, is trying to build those relationships. And I mean, over the past few years that I've been doing it, it's been nice enough that I've got a little more help from the provincial side of it. We usually relied heavily on the federal entomologists and pathologists, because they're a little closer and based out of Beaver Lodge, which is near Grand Prairie. So trying to get over the Rockies, it seems to be some of the trouble in that sense.
There's a fellow at Summerland, I think, no, not Summerland, at Agassiz, Todd. He's at Summerland, or not, no, yeah, he's at the research center in Agassiz there, and he's doing work with wireworm. So if you're interested, I don't know if you met him yet or talked to him.
Him and Wim Van Herk, they do a lot of wireworm work.
Yeah.
In general, and yeah, we in 2017 we started working with Wim just to try and develop an understanding of what species were present in the piece in regards to wireworms, because I mean, I think when Wim did his background research, it was 1940 when the last survey was done. So I mean, that's, you know, almost 70, 80 years ago now. and in talking to the provincial entomologist as well, like just with trying to do some of this horticulture stuff, it, when I brought it up to her, she was just like, no, I don't know if anybody's done any of that, like looking in to see what's there and what's not, into regards to like spotted winged Drosophila, or, you know, like some of those insects. So it's interesting. And I mean, like spotted winged Drosophila has been found in, I believe it's in Saskatchewan, and like I said, southern Alberta, and it's prevalent in BC as well. So I mean, it's almost in some ways it's a question of when rather than if it will get here in some respects, with just the way the climate is shifting so much. So yeah.